Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I understand you've been told that I'm Alan Haselhurst, the chairman of the UK branch of the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association. It's my great pleasure to introduce in this keynote session His Excellency Alexander Downer, who probably, as they say, doesn't need a lot of introduction. He was Australia's foreign minister for 11 years from 1996 to 2007. And which is the longest period, I understand, anyone has held that highly important post. And he has had a distinguished career both academically and politically. More recently, the UN representative for Cyprus. So it's been a very varied life he's had, but we're delighted that he's now in London, has been since March, as the Australian High Commissioner here. And is it correct that your father served in London on some previous occasions? So there's a big Downer tradition. So without more ado, Excellency, I thank you very much indeed for finding the time to be with us today, and we look forward to your address.
Well, thanks very much, Alan, and ladies and gentlemen. I'll get myself out of that light. It's rather crippling. So first of all, it's a pleasure for me to come along and to talk to you, and I can see from the list you're from an extremely diverse group of countries from all over the world. And as Sir Alan was just saying, I used to be the Australian Foreign Minister for many years, and so because I was in that job for so long, I can see, looking down the list of countries, I've been to a very high percentage of them and have something of a sense of the challenges that your different countries face. As you know, Australia has, over the last year, presided over the G20. And this has been an interesting challenge because for us, when we first came to this position, inheriting the chairmanship of the G20, or the presidency as they call it, of the G20 from Russia, we had a degree of concern that to make a multilateral institution like that meaningful would require a fair bit of work. And I know from my own experience that often when you go to multilateral meetings, they're the triumph of form over substance. Just the fact that the meeting has happened is seen to be sufficient, and as long as everybody gets a turn to say something and all they do is read something out from a prepared text put together by officials in government ministries, then that is seen to be sufficient. And of course, it's, from our point of view, wasn't going to be a sufficient approach to the G20. We take the G20 pretty seriously because unlike the G8, well now it's the G7, unlike the G7, the G20 has a much broader representation of countries. Obviously there are more countries, but it's not just that. The countries in the G20 all by definition large economies, the 20 roughly largest economies. It's not quite literally the 20 largest economies in the world, but roughly the 20 largest economies in the world, include developed and developing countries. They include countries from all continents. They include, if you like, a series of different political perspectives as well. Some of them traditional liberal democracies like this country or Australia, but countries with political institutions quite at variance with that, such as China. So this brings together, if you like, a powerful representation of the world, both politically and economically. So the second thing is that we didn't look upon the G20 as a political body, but more as an economic body. So thinking about that, we took a view which I think you're all very familiar with, which is that global economic growth is low, it's relatively flat. In the European Union, in the Eurozone, they're running the risk of a triple-dip recession. This country, of course, is growing pretty strongly. The United States is not doing too badly these days. But in the BRICS, as they're sometimes called, Brazil, Russia, India, and so on, China especially, the rates of economic growth have fallen quite substantially. So overall, the picture for global growth is a much less rosy one than it has been in years gone by. So what would we use the G20 for? We would use, as we did, the G20 as a vehicle for trying to encourage those 20 or so, slightly more than 20, those 20 or so countries to stimulate economic growth. Now, all countries, by definition, are going to have slightly different or very different economic circumstances. They're at different stages of economic development. They have different policy approaches, so the list goes on. So we didn't approach the G20 with a one-size-fits-all approach. We have more said each of those individual countries should come to the G20 meeting with a commitment to increase their rate of economic growth, and to do that through structural reform, because how else are you going to increase economic growth? And that's what each country did. Each came along with a particular plan of their own. There will be some peer group assessment by international financial institutions of those economic plans. When the G20 next meets, and Turkey is taking over the leadership of the G20, there'll be an opportunity for the G20 to examine how well those countries have implemented their economic reform plans. In any case, according to the best assessments of these reform plans that each individual country brought along to the meeting in Brisbane, and of course the build-up to that meeting, these reforms will contribute a further 2.1% to global economic growth. On the face of it, that's a good thing. What sort of reforms are important and what sort of reforms aren't important? Well, if you wanted the view of the Australian government, so not everybody agrees with the Australian government, but if you want the views of the Australian government, the reason why some countries grow better than others is that they essentially make themselves more attractive to investors. So if your country is not an attractive country to investors, be they foreign or domestic investors, then it follows rather logically that you're not going to get the capital into your country to drive economic growth and create jobs. So what are the obstacles to attracting investment into your country? Well, first of all, we argue that it's a bit of an issue here in the UK, as it is in many countries in Europe especially, that you have to have a degree of fiscal responsibility. Yes, you can spend more than you collect in taxes if you're the government. You can do that for a while, until you reach a point where it becomes increasingly expensive for you to borrow money. And as it becomes increasingly expensive for you to borrow money, you're starting to get yourself into financial difficulties. We've seen this, of course, in some of the economies in the Eurozone, in the case of Ireland and Portugal, Spain, Greece, Cyprus and so on, which is a very harsh lesson, and we've seen this in certainly many parts of the developing world over the years, where governments simply reach a point where financial markets won't lend them money. Well, you can rail against the financial institutions for not lending you money, you can denounce the bankers for not lending you money. It's not going to help you. In the end, if you've borrowed so much money that you can't borrow any more, then you have a major problem. So we try to drive into people's minds the idea that there must be a degree of fiscal responsibility. Governments can only do so much. Government, after all, is not going to be the main investor and driver of economic activity. That's going to be the private sector. So that brings me back to what I was saying before, and that is how do you make your economy beyond sound public finances attractive to investors? Well, we always say to people, at the very heart of the answer to that question lies a system of individual property rights which are protected by the rule of law and independent judiciary. If in your country you don't have that, then your country is not going to be attractive to investors. Investors are putting their money into whatever the project might be in your country. If the courts are capricious, if judges can be bought, if the politicians, the government, imposes what we would call a high sovereign risk on investors by being unpredictable. If property rights are not properly respected, mining leases are granted, but the local people don't like it very much, and the lease is just taken away. If you can't predict what the President or the Prime Minister or whoever it is going to do in terms of the tax regime, and suddenly super taxes are imposed on a business, well, it's best not to invest in that country. Now, this may or may not sound like a very simple proposition, but it's an argument that we make over and over again. So when we look at our country, Australia, yes, Australia is a pretty successful economy, I guess. It's the 12th biggest economy in the world, and it's the 5th richest economy in the world in per capita terms, so it's done reasonably well. But having said that, we're not beyond self-criticism. In our own case, we look very carefully at our taxation system and need to make judgments about whether we think our taxation system is sufficiently amiable to people who are going to create jobs and generate economic growth in our country. To have a punitive tax system might be absolutely fine for people in government who simply want to rake in revenue and farm bounty out to people in order to get votes. But it probably won't do very much to stimulate your economy and economic growth. So our tax system has been reviewed and revised from time to time. I think probably it's reaching a point where it needs another review and another revision and a bit of improvement and a greater degree of efficiency than it currently has. You want a tax system which is economically pretty neutral. You don't want the government through the tax system to be making decisions about where people should be investing. You want the market to work that out for them. And that is the way, one of the ways that you will help to stimulate investment in the most productive areas of your economy and stimulate economic growth. So we think that one of the reasons global economic growth is as slow as it is, and there are a lot of explanations for that, is that particularly in these major economies there has been insufficient structural reform of the economies. That is, reform of the tax system, reform of the labour market, ensuring that there's an efficient and flexible labour market, not dominated by self-interested monopolies, that there is indeed within the economy a competitive market in key areas of economic activity. So, for example, in areas like telecommunications, in a lot of countries, the telecommunications are owned by a monopoly. The monopoly is a state monopoly, unlikely to maximise economic gains through that sort of a structure. So we've used the G20 as best we can to try to encourage countries to pursue economic reform with a view to making themselves more appealing to investors, making their economies more profitable, and therefore creating jobs and stimulating economic growth again. I think overall, for all the publicity that's come out of the G20 meeting, it's sort of mixed, but I think overall it has been very successful as a meeting and as a body in transmitting some of these sorts of messages that I've been talking about this evening, and getting the major economies to orient themselves in this sort of way. The other thing that we have been very focused on is the agenda of trade liberalisation. Some countries judge that they're going to be best off by pursuing policies of import substitution. That is, close their borders to exports from other countries, to imports, and to try to do it all themselves. And it's, it was a very popular policy in particularly a lot of the developing world through the 1960s, 50s, 60s and into the 1970s. And I think it is the view anyway of the Australian government. It's the view of the Australian government that that's not a policy that's likely to work. We abandoned in the 1980s most of our tariff protection and quotas that we used to have in Australia and completely opened up our economy to the world. That has led to restructuring of our economy brought about just by the fact that some industries which weren't protected were demolished. So textiles, clothing and footwear, that was which was made in Australia, is now imported from typically from Asia, from China, Indochina, India and so on. And that means that all the jobs that once existed in those industries, they're gone. And yet our unemployment rate has not gone up. So it's an interesting illustration about the economics of free trade, because of course people are able to buy clothes and shoes and things much more cheaply as a result of the tearing down of the barriers, which meant that although they weren't buying Australian produced textiles, clothing and footwear, they had money left over that they spent on other things in Australia, and in particular they spent that money on services. So we've seen a move in our economy, which is a very high cost, very high wage economy, away from, if you like, relatively low skilled manufacturing into the services sector. So increasingly that's how we make our money as a country, as well as through resources. As you'd be familiar with, Australia has a very substantial resources sector, which contributes about 15% of its GDP, so it's an important component as well as our economy. So we have deregulated our economy in that respect, and we have also made it perfectly clear that we think the world would be a better place if it was pretty much a free trade zone. That's not going to happen overnight. Politically, it's very difficult for governments to reduce tariff protection. We'd hoped for many years that this sort of work could be done on a multilateral basis through the World Trade Organization. So when I talk about the world becoming a free trade zone, that is an optimal vision, and it's important to have at least an idealized view of what ultimately might be achievable one day. As I say, we obviously know that's not going to happen anytime soon. I think we have to be frank about this. The World Trade Organization has achieved very little in recent times, despite the fact that many a multilateral meeting has argued for progress in the WTO, particularly the Doha round of multilateral trade negotiations. Anyway, look, it hasn't happened, and that's just as it is. We ourselves have entered into a whole lot of bilateral free trade agreements, and these, we'd have to say, have been pretty beneficial. So we have to start with, we had a free trade agreement with New Zealand. There's nothing very controversial about that. You can imagine Australia and New Zealand having a free trade agreement, and that goes back to 1983 and has been pretty successful for both countries. But we have particularly focused on free trade agreements in Asia. So we started relatively small with a free trade agreement with Singapore. We have a free trade agreement with Thailand. And then most dramatically, we've negotiated free trade agreements with our three largest trading partners, China, Japan and Korea. So in the last week, in the context of the G20 meeting, we concluded with President Xi Jinping a free trade agreement with the People's Republic of China, which over a period of 4 years will lead to 94% of Australian exports to China going into China free of any tariffs. Now, for China, that's not directly reciprocated because we have virtually no tariffs at all on Chinese exports to Australia, even now. So what did China want from Australia? And here it comes back to a bit of a theme that I've been developing here, the theme of investment. What China wanted from Australia was access for Chinese investors into the Australian market to invest in mining, resources sector, property, agriculture, aquaculture, all kinds of things, manufacturing industry and so on, particularly at the high-tech end. Chinese companies like Huawei want to invest in Australian high-tech companies to take them over. This is a little bit controversial because within Australia, people, being the public, think, well, what's it going to mean to us if we allow Chinese companies to come in here and and buy up our own companies? The answer to that is it's going to lead to a huge influx of investment into our country. So we have said to the Chinese, you can have exactly the same terms that we give the Americans and the Japanese to invest in Australia, and that is you can invest up to $1 billion in any particular project without having to get any approvals from the Australian government. So that is something the Chinese really wanted. That's something they'll get. That's great for Chinese companies who think they can make a profit out of investing in Australia. It's great for us because it means we're going to be able to sell things to the Chinese, sell assets to the Chinese, get the money through the sale of those assets and reinvest that money in other ways. So it's all how we perceive our economy can best work. So bilateral free trade agreements, they're a second best. There's no doubt about that. It's better to have a multilateral free trade agreement, but bilateral free trade agreements are a good second best. We're also working within APEC to, and some of you come from relevant countries here, within APEC to negotiate the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the Trans-Pacific Partnership is about creating still more free trade in the Asia-Pacific region. So the G20 was another really useful vehicle for promoting the trade liberalisation agenda. And I think you probably picked up my general theme here, and that is that we were about market liberalisation, a very traditional approach to economics. Just to remind you, it's worked pretty well for us over the last 200 or so years, and I think it can be demonstrated that it invariably does work well. Right. So the argument, and where I'll conclude, the argument against market liberalisation is, well, it's not fair. The rich get richer and the poor get poorer. Well, that's not really our experience, by the way. The rich do get richer. We don't have a problem with people getting rich. Good luck to them, as long as they're not getting rich at the expense of poor people and making poor people still poorer. That's not our experience. Poor people in Australia have progressively got richer as well. Poor people are not rich, they're still poor, but they've got substantially richer through just running an economy in the sort of ways that I've been describing and we've been promoting through the G20. But to have a fair system, there must be a fair tax system. And one of the points that was made at the G20 meeting the other day in Brisbane was that companies that operate in your country, in any of our countries, should pay fair taxes in those countries and not try to find artificial ways of circumventing tax. Now, I know this has been a big issue here in the UK in relation to a number of companies which sort of set up shelf companies in other parts of the European Union where the corporation tax is much lower than it is here in the UK, though it is quite low in the UK. And we don't want to see that happening in Australia. It has happened a bit in Australia as well. We don't want to use see tax havens used to circumvent our tax system. We expect companies that invest in Australia and throughout the G20 to be good corporate citizens, to be prepared to pay their taxes on their profits and to make a contribution to the broader welfare of society. If they don't do that, then that creates a perception of unfairness and a reality also of unfairness that makes the politics of a liberal market a lot more difficult to sell to a public which in our case, and I think probably in the case of most countries, is intuitively not terribly much in favour of free and competitive markets. I think that's all the time I've got to talk to you about this, but I hope you get a sense of the G20 being a really useful vehicle bringing together the major economies of the world. I mean, something like 80% of global GDP, and pushing right across the political and developing country spectrum for the right kinds of reforms that will re-stimulate global economic growth in the years ahead. And I suppose I should have mentioned in passing, make sure that the banking system becomes more stable and more predictable than we saw happen in 2008, though we have our own views for why the global financial crisis occurred. Some people say it was because bankers got greedy. I'm not sure that that bankers in 2006, 7, 8 were any greedier than bankers would have been 10, 20, 30, 50 or 150 years earlier. I suspect level of greed is a bit of a constant, which is quite a high constant. I think it might have been something to do with the mortgage system in the United States being unsustainable when property prices started to fall and interest rates started to rise, which led to a chain effect throughout the financial system. So the G20 has been looking in particular at this notion of banks being too big to fail. So if you take the UK, since we're all in the UK, when the Royal Bank of Scotland failed, the government had to bail it out. The cost to the taxpayers of bailing out a huge financial institution like that is a cost that they're still bearing here in managing their budget. We didn't have any of that in Australia. We had a regulatory regime in place which led to our banks pretty much eschewing the sort of assets that a lot of the bigger banks in New York and London bought, which were fragile assets, and of course led to the collapse of or near collapse of the financial system. In any case, we want to put in place, and the G20 has put in place now agreed mechanisms to try to manage these sort of situations better. So it's important I just flag that at the very end. So thanks very much. I hope that gives you, what I want to do is leave with you some sense of optimism about the G20, try to get you away from the inherent pessimism that one has about the performance of many multilateral institutions. I, as Alan was saying earlier, used to be the foreign minister. I've sat through many a UN meeting, including in the Security Council. I've sat through many APEC meetings, all kinds of ASEAN meetings and so on over the years. And it's easy to think that these meetings are not going very far. But I'd like to try to persuade you that I think the G20 has been pretty effective, at least this year, in pursuing a really tightly argued agenda. But the ultimate proof of its efficacy is going to be in the implementation of the things that the governments there promised they would do. I can't make any promises about that. Some will no doubt do better than others, some will have more resolve than others, some will have more political problems than others. We'll just have to wait and see. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Time for 2 or 3 questions?
Yeah.